been in dialogue with with me, with the school district, but also it'll have real application. I think it certainly has impacted me as a parent. My hope is it'll be helpful for all of you as well. And then the other thing is, I guess, this community gives me a real sense of belonging. So I'm grateful for the to be able to continue to come back to this community, to be with all of you, so many familiar faces. So thank you for coming back. And also, the staff here has really welcomed me in a way that's been meaningful. So I'm grateful for that. So I want to start just with seeing if my clicker will work. It does. All right, so just take a minute, put both feet flat on the ground, if you don't mind. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable with that. And I just want you to take 30 seconds. You can do this at home too, if you will, is just quiet everything and begin to notice. Just notice your breathing. Notice what your body's telling you. Let's take 30 seconds. When you're ready, just open your eyes, but notice what it is that you are feeling, or physically, emotionally. How often do you get 30 seconds just to quiet? Do that feel all right to people? People want it to be longer, right? It's like there are very few times in our day that we do this. And so now, if you wouldn't mind just turning to somebody and noticing. So the zones of regulation is something that schools use a lot, but I think it's good for all of us. Just what are you noticing as you were there? Are you in the blue zone? Are you feeling kind of tired and dragging after a long day? Hopefully you're not bored already. Are you in the green zone? It's like, no, things are good. I'm ready to go. Are you in the yellow zone because your kids were fighting as you walked out of the house, right? Or are you in the red zone? In which case, we've got counselors in the back to help you with that, right? So just share with one another, what zone are you in, and do you need anything? Do you need to be on your phone to be checking your kids? Do you need to go to the restroom at some point? Whatever it is you need. So just share with one another, what zone are you in, and what do you need?
It's unusual. It's to be in the green. I slow that.
One of the interesting things that happens when we talk about our zones is we learn a little something more about one another, right? Just a little. There's often a story behind our zones, and there's going to be a method to this madness, and why I asked you to do that. But here's I want to start with a concept called biomimicry. Anyone know what biomimicry is? So biomimicry is, the definition is innovation that's inspired by nature. The idea is that whenever we have problems in our world, nature has solved a lot of them for us. Nature's been around for a long time, and there are solutions in nature that are often and can be metaphors for challenges that we're having now. So one of the things that the way I learned about this was with the Beijing Olympics, 2008. Remember, there were how many world records fell during that Olympics? I think it was like 65 or 69 medals fell, and part of it's because Michael Phelps, right, was just a fast swimmer. But there's another reason why. Does anybody remember? It was the swimsuits. They designed these swimsuits. And how did they design the swimsuits? Based on shark skin. They realized, oh, nature's already figured out a way to get through water. So we're going to use shark skin technology to design these swimsuits. And as I was doing this work, and I was the principal at North Shore Academy, what I realized, let me just check, is everything okay over there? Okay. What I realized is that forests can be a metaphor for our school communities and our family communities. And so I wanted to share with you how botanists describe forests. They say that trees are community beings. They shelter one another from wind and weather. A lone tree is often bent and broken in the face of many storms, but when a stiff wind blows through a clustered grove, they sway and bend together. And here's the thing I didn't know, is that they are connected by an underground network of roots and fungus. And with this network, they actually find that trees communicate with one another. And what they find is that they support their own offspring. They send warning signals about injury or disease throughout the forest. They don't donate resources to one another. It's amazing what's happening under there. And they call this network the Wood Wide Web. Aren't they clever? But here's the thing, a 17th century botanist grew plants in sterile soil and distilled water, and they died. He imagined there was some invisible force that was at work, some magical unseen element that caused life to root down and grow up with unswerving tenacity. And he called this manna. And so I guess the thing for me is, how can our schools, how can our homes create that manna for our kids? That underground, unseen element of connection and belonging. So I gave this talk earlier this afternoon, so you're getting the same talk that the staff did, which I love that we're kind of doing this learning together. And so in many ways, education has changed a lot in the last 20 to 25 years. And I think it's been profound how it's changed. And it started, I think, it started before NCLB, but certainly with NCLB. No Child Left Behind was a big part of it. And what they did with NCLB was they decided we need kids' test scores to be higher. And so we're going to measure schools, students, classrooms, teachers, schools, districts based on their test scores so we can get these test scores up. It makes sense that we wanted to do this. And what we were going to do, and then we created these multiple measure systems for teachers to make sure that they are teaching their kids so their kids get higher test scores. And so this was the focus, is how can we get our test scores up? It makes sense. But one of the things that began to happen is we began to focus less on people and more on data. And I think that's been a problem for us as schools. And to be honest with you, us as parents, I'm from Evanston, I mentioned that, especially in high performing school districts. One of the things that that I learned about was Goodhart's Law. What Goodhart's Law says is once you measure a target, it ceases to be a good measure. What that means is once we focus on the target itself, then there's a lot of stuff that we miss and lose. I heard about this also through cardiac surgeons. What would happen with cardiac surgeons, they began to measure cardiac surgeons based on how successful their surgeries were. And so the best surgeons then started refusing to operate on the most vulnerable patients, which undermines what we hope for in our healthcare system. And I think the same thing can happen. One of the things we know is that it actually didn't work. NCLB didn't work. Kind of in the heart of NCLB, what they found is that the schools failing to make adequate yearly progress went up, not down. More schools were struggling. Kids were doing worse. And in the meantime, there were some unintended consequences. That students started hurting more. They started getting more stressed. And teachers started leaving. There's a teacher shortage. There's a teacher shortage, right? That I think is causing huge problems. And also something we talked about last time is that kids in high-performing schools, just attending a high-performing school like Sears School, puts kids at risk. Why is that? Because in the same way that trauma, in the same way that poverty, in the same way that discrimination causes stress in kids, excessive pressure to excel is the new stress. And here's the thing. We talked last time about the suicide rate for kids is 2 times higher when school is in session. Take a look at this data. I hadn't seen this graph before. Look at this data. Look what happens in the summer. Emergency room visits for kids go dramatically down at the end of the school year, stay through the summer. They go dramatically up in September. And take a look, they go down again during winter break. This is pretty compelling data, saying that our kids are stressed and it's showing up with mental health issues. I like what this business consultant says. He says, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. We've created a system And we're all part of it. Well, it's not me as a parent, me as a principal, I've been part of it. And it's not to say we shouldn't look at data. I don't want you to come away with, oh, data doesn't matter. No, data is really important. We need to be able to measure progress for kids. So it's not about the data. It's about what comes first. See, the focus on numbers often comes at the cost of our ability to connect. And what we're going to talk about today, and what is very clear in the research, is that it's our ability to connect that creates our ability to learn, which drives the numbers. We just have it backwards. What happens is we say, oh, I don't have time to do all that touchy-feely stuff in my classroom. I've got to hit all these learning targets. We don't have time to have a class meeting when I've got to get my test scores up, right? It's a little bit like this, isn't it? We don't have time. So we just keep going. Last time we talked about the mental health parable, I'm not sure if you remember, of the kids in the river, right? And we went in to save the kids in the river, and we couldn't understand, and we couldn't get all these kids out of the river. And then one of the people by the river trying to save these kids went upstream to say, I've got to stop these kids before they fall in. And so that's, I think, our work. And it shows up as mental health problems. It shows up as behavior problems. When we focus on the mental health, when we focus on the depression or anxiety and say, well, I'm going to figure out how to get a medication or a therapist for that, we are looking downstream. And yes, we do need to have people getting kids out of the water. Don't get me wrong. But we need to be looking upstream to figure out, why is it that they're experiencing this? And upstream problems are things like stress and trauma and discrimination and poverty and development and this pressure to excel. And so what I want to do in this series is to marry what we know about the research with our practice as parents, with our practice as schools. And it doesn't mean, I think one of the things that we often worry about is it means we do nothing, right? Oh, we don't expect anything from our kids. Oh, we shouldn't set any limits on them. No, it's not that. The difference is that we do it differently. It's not that we don't do anything. And we think about behavior from a different point of view. So looking upstream, I want to talk about creating communities of belonging. And here's what I've got the thing is, that's interesting to me is we've all been part of communities where we've thrived. I hope we have, right? The communities where we just love being there, we're our best selves. People get the best out of us. We grow and we learn and we develop. And I want you just to think, what made that experience so special? What was it? You each have one of those places in your life. And what made it special? And here's what I want you to do. I'd love to hear just for a minute how you would describe that place where you thrive. All right, what's that place where you thrive, and how would you describe it? Wants to just whatever words come to mind, whatever.
Feeling accepted.
Accepted, yeah.
You're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
Maybe you're not in great position, but you're all there together.
Yeah, we're in together. And at some level, I love the way you framed that too. It's not just about being in it together. It's like we're in it together whether it's hard or when it's going well, right? Love that.
That's pretty similar to camaraderie.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's like it's fun, right? We're building relationships and we're connected in camaraderie. I think that I love that image of camaraderie. Yeah. What else? Yeah. There's a common vision and shared objectives, right? And what that means is we're doing something important. We're doing something together, and we're doing something that has purpose, that has meaning. What else? Yeah. So there's when we have this sense of camaraderie, we're in it together, we've got a shared objective, we hold one another accountable. And we aren't held accountable because we're afraid we're going to get punished. We're held accountable because what we're doing is important. And everybody needs to contribute, right? Love that.
Values.
Yeah. Yeah, we feel like, we feel worthwhile. We contribute, we're valued. Yeah, yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that?
One of the things that, feeling other people have back.
Yeah, yeah,
That goes along with it. Value that, but other people-
and when we're down, people support us instead of reject us, right? People have our back. I love that. So it's interesting. One of the things that happens, just thinking about these places lifts our mood, right? It actually, our heart rate changes just thinking about places where we've been connected. So the opposite is also true, isn't it? We've also been a part of toxic cultures. Places where we're not our best. Places that we dread being a part of or going to. So I'd love to hear also what some of those places might be for you. Like what is, how would you describe those places? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, really alone. Sorry, I'm a little slow with this. Isolated. Every man for themselves. Every person. We can't be ourselves. Did I hear that? Yeah. Yeah, we're in it. Our focus is protecting ourselves. Yeah. And what that means is we're threatened, right? If we've got to continue to feel like we've got to protect ourselves.
Lack of fairness, lack of accountability.
Yep. A lot of people say, it feels like, people play favorites. People don't, it's not based, it's based on your relationship with people instead of the work that you do and who you are. Yeah. Nuts. Yeah. Yeah, some competition can be healthy and get the best out of us, but this doesn't do that, right?
Pecking order or.
Yeah. Yeah, you from last time too, right? That this idea that everybody is working to make sure they're not on the bottom. And even the people on the top are fighting for that top spot, right?
Criticize.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's very critical and it can feel very personal too, without feeling like, oh, the criticism is helping me become better. It feels like the criticism is here to knock me down. Anything else?
But you were more helpful, but ultimately you end up kind of withdrawing and
Yes.
checking out.
Yep. Yeah, we withdraw, we check out, right? We don't want to go. We feel powerless, so why show? We don't feel like we're contributing, so why show up? So, all right. So typically I put these up. I can't even read my own handwriting, so I'm not even gonna. I don't even know why I wrote these down. But we'll leave them right there. All right. So anyways, but this is what we know is when we put ourselves in these places, we feel different, right? Here's the thing. Schools have always been places of being toxic and being places where kids thrive. And the same thing for our homes. And what we know is that you can have one kid in your house who's thriving and one who's not. You can have kids in one class. There's not a thriving classroom and a toxic classroom. There's more variability in between. But what we know is that the kids who are not thriving, the kids who experience our communities as toxic, are more vulnerable. And you guys did a beautiful job of laying out just why. And so the question, and the thing is, as kids struggle more, they feel more isolated. They feel like they need to take care of themselves and not take care of the community, right? They can't be themselves. Because if I'm being myself, I'm gonna get excluded, right? It doesn't feel fair to people. Like all of these things, it shows up, and then it begins to spiral. And here's the thing. The community that we're in has a huge impact on how we act. And usually I can see my slides. I'm going to do this. I'm going to see if I can see this. All right. So this is a long quote, but I like it. It's by a guy named Nicholas Christakis, who's done a ton of work on groups. And he said, people often think of the personality traits such as kindness are fixed, but our research with groups suggests something quite different. The tendency to be altruistic or exploitative may depend heavily on how the social world is organized. So we take one kid and we put them into one classroom, or we put them onto one team, they could do really well. They could be very generous to one another. But then if we put them in another classroom, another team, in our families, if we put them with some brothers and sisters and not others, all of a sudden they can look very different. And the thing that I wonder about for you, and it's really been true for me as I've looked at it, is did you show up differently in the toxic community versus the thriving community? Did you behave different? I know that I did. And I think, I'm an old guy and I'm a psychologist. It's like, no, I should be more involved than that. But no, it's amazing the power that a community has to impact how I show up. So there were a lot of problems in the 1760s, but I want to talk about one. Europeans were coming to America, and they were starting to push into Pennsylvania and Ohio. They wanted the land. The Native American communities did not want to give up that land. And so what they did was they had wars, correct? So there were a lot of wars. Now what happens when there are wars is we take prisoners in those wars. And at the end of the war, we give those prisoners back, right? They get to go back when we're all done. Well, that's exactly what happened. They took prisoners, the wars ended, they said, you can go back. And here's where it got tricky. And this is from a French journalist back in the 1780s. He noticed, he said, thousands of Europeans chose to stay with the Indians. But we have no example of even one of those Indians choosing to become European. There must be in their social order something singularly captivating and far superior to anything that can be boasted of among us. Benjamin Franklin actually talks a lot about this. And so Sebastian Junger then, in his book Tribe, it's a great book, it's a short book, he says the intensely communal nature of the Indian tribe held an appeal that the material benefits of Western civilization couldn't compete with. How much would they have to pay you? How much would you have to get paid to go back into that toxic place? Right? Most people would say, I think you couldn't pay me enough. I wouldn't go back. And this is what the Europeans were experiencing. And so what this shows us, and we've known this for such a long time, is that the core of our being is belonging. And our schools in particular have a belonging problem. They did some research. America likes to be first. We are not first in belonging. They did an international study of belonging in middle school. They looked at 12,000 kids and 32,000 students in 12 countries, and the US was last. In the US, in high school, only 51% of kids say they belong. In our middle schools, there's a significant decline in all middle schools from 6th grade to 8th grade in their experience of belonging. I think that's probably because in elementary school, you've got your classroom, and as hard as that may be, you've got your classroom and you have to work together to get through it, right? In middle school, you've got to figure out, how do I interact with all these different teachers? And it's hard at that time. And the kids who struggle the most experience the loss of belonging in middle school. So here is a wonder. I love this definition of belonging. It's the feeling that we're part of a larger group that values and cares for us, and to which we have something to contribute. It's really the definition you guys created, isn't it? Of your place where you thrive. So why is it so important? Belonging really does two very important things. The first is it opens our brains for learning. So when we think about the problems our kids are having, take a look at what the research on belonging tells us. Kids who experience belonging are more motivated to learn, they perform better academically, they have better attendance, engage in less misconduct, they're healthier, they have higher self-esteem and better mental health. Now, as parents, as educators, what else would you add to that list? I don't know what else I would add to that list. I don't think I would add anything to that list if I'm really caring about making sure that my kid is going to be successful as an adult. It's creating these communities of belonging. And if we do that because our kids do better academically, test scores go up. This is why if we focus on belonging first in our homes and our schools, then test scores go up. This is saying, let's focus on test scores. Let's figure out how we can add more curriculum. No, we can add more curriculum. We can get the test scores up if we first help kids open their brains up for learning. And the second thing, and maybe even more important, is that it buffers the impact of stress and trauma. They took a look at 12,000 teenagers and found the single most powerful, the most powerful protective factors for every form of adolescent distress, adolescent risk behavior, emotional distress, drug abuse, violence, and suicidality. Two things: their sense of belonging at home and at school. Well, you've got a staff here who are working to make sure this happens in school, and you guys have the ability to create this at home as best you can. And so this is our work. Now, how does this work? So there's different kinds of stress. There is positive stress. That's kind of a funny one, right? Positive stress, what they look at is your stress response, right? Your heart rate and other things. When they go up and come back down, that's what they call positive stress. If you are giving a toast at a wedding, your stress response goes up, and then it's done, and you hit the open bar, and you're good, right? No more stress response. Then you've got tolerable stress, which is stress that lasts several months, right? The loss of a loved one. It may be an injury or illness or something else, but something you're going to get through. And then there's toxic stress, which is this constant activation of your stress response because you can't escape the level of stress. For many kids, these are the stresses in their homes. But take a look at what's common for these two other kinds of stress is that relationships buffer the impact of that stress. And so when we can create, what happens is it creates a connective tissue. So when things are hard, and I think you mentioned, like when things are bad, people are there to support me, right? In a healthy community, that's what happens. When we don't have that, we're especially vulnerable. And so if we can do this, mental health problems go down when we've got kids who experience these communities where they are physically healthy, they are able to engage in a healthy ways, and they've got this network of support around them. And here's the thing, we don't need to hire belonging coaches, right? Or belonging tutors. We've got belonging opportunities everywhere we go. We don't have to have a belonging teacher. It doesn't impact the school budget. As long as we get more than two or three people together, we've got a community. And then we can create this. That's what I love about what families can create. And here's the thing, little things matter. We are constantly sending these belonging and othering cues. When my son, I told you about my son, Matthew, who was really struggling for a long time in high school. And I got to tell you, when he walked through the door and I knew that he had skipped all afternoon, and I asked him how his school day went, and he said, great. I'm sure that I was sending some othering cues his way. I couldn't look him in the eye, right? I was either biting my lip and walking away. I was sending all sorts of messages to him. And then it became more and more common that it was harder and harder for me to show up in a way that says, I'm so glad to see you, when I was so worried and then frustrated with him. he was getting a lot of cues that say, you're not doing good enough. I can't even, I'm so frustrated with you. Here's the thing. Even fleeting experiences of belonging can have far-reaching benefits. They raise our sense of well-being and self-worth. They improve our performance. They lessen our defensiveness and hostility. They increase our tolerance of others, of outsiders, and make us more compassionate. It is a condition for success. I'll tell you, it's amazing. I can go through the grocery line, and if the person bagging my groceries is super nice and gives me a smile, it boosts me, right? It's amazing how just these little moments, I walk in, and someone I haven't seen in a while gives me a big hug, right? I feel that when I walk into this building and I see people and they're like, oh, I'm so glad you're here. It boosts me, right? And here's the thing, we notice these things within a blink of an eye. Like we're constantly sending these messages and we're constantly receiving these messages. Often we aren't necessarily conscious of them, but we just feel like, oh, I'm not really wanted here. You know, there were times when I would try and make it look like it, I try and put a good face on things with Matthew, right? But he could tell, he knew me. I'm expressing all sorts of things from all sorts of expressions here. They know when we're faking it, don't they? Like, have you ever had someone being fake nice to you? We pick that up, right? And so we need to really figure out, how can I be genuinely, when Matthew's struggling the most, how can I be even more genuinely connected to him? Because the opposite is also true. When our sense of belonging is threatened, even momentarily, we're more likely to feel worse about ourselves, perform below our potential, behave impulsively, see others as hostile, and lash out defensively. So as I was giving these cues to Matthew, he was much more likely to do these things. Brene Brown, I'm sure many of you are Brene Brown fans. If you're not yet, you should be. She talks a lot about this. And so what she says, a deep sense of love and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, to belong. When those needs aren't met, we don't function as we're meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick. That's really what happens in these toxic places, right? The kids who struggle the most are often the ones who don't feel like they belong. Susie Wise says, belonging is the key that unlocks the best in all of us. And so I want to talk about some ways, both in school and at home, that we can create belonging. And I didn't change this slide. I've only got 6 strategies for you. All right, I'll give you the 7th strategy if you come back. All right. So the first strategy is embed SEL. You guys have heard of social emotional learning. Everybody's heard of social emotional learning. Anybody really know what it is? It's one of those things we talk about a lot. So the nice thing is that the people who do the most research and have the greatest voice on social emotional learning, they're right in Chicago. And here's what they say. Social emotional learning is self-awareness and self-management, social awareness and relationship skills. And if we do all those things, we make our best decisions. Now, when theories dovetail, it tells me we're onto something. And Bruce Perry is an expert. He is the leading voice in trauma and resilience. And here's what he says. He says, in order to access our best brains, we need to be emotionally regulated and we need to be connected in relationship. And next time we're going to talk a lot about emotional regulation and how we can support our kids in their emotional regulation. But first we need to be regulated. And then we need to be, if we're going to really be able to access our best brains, we've got to be around people like you described, people we trust, people who value us, people who support us. That's when we can learn. That's when we can make our best decisions. And so when we take a look at this, regulation is all about self-awareness and self-management, right? Relationship is all about social awareness and relationship skills. And then we can access reason, right? And so this is all the same stuff. And it's not that complicated. The question is, when our kids are struggling the most in school or at home, before we do anything, can we make sure that they're regulated and we're regulated? Can we make sure we've got a relationship with them where they trust us? And then let's have the hard conversation. Then let's try and teach them and share our values. We talk about this as the 3 R's. Can we get regulated? Take this brain that's so struggling with so many different things and clear it, so that it's more open for learning. That's why I had you do that little quiet 30 seconds, right? That's what helps us get there. And the research on this is pretty compelling, right? If we do some basic mindfulness activities, we reduce stress, anxiety, and conflict, and we increase our emotional regulation, our concentration, our achievement, our compassion, and our empathy. Not bad, right? And so these are some tools that we've got. It's hard for us to implement them for ourselves and for our kids. But if we want our kids to have less stress, anxiety, and conflict, if we want them to be more regulated, to concentrate better, to be able to engage so they can achieve, to have more compassion and empathy, let's give them some moments of quiet. And can we make sure that we're connected with them so they can access their best brain? So that's why I do this, right? Before we start. So your brains can open up a little bit. That's why I do this. Because take a look. I think that when I ask what zone are you in and what do you need, it hits all of these. What zone are you in? Self-awareness. What do you need? Self-management. When you hear it from someone else, you're aware of what's happening in their world, in their lives, how they're feeling. And for kids especially, it helps them practice relationship skills of sharing and listening. And this idea that I can be aware of what's happening for me. The thing about social emotional learning is it doesn't, like, you wouldn't send your kid to walking school. And he's only going to walk, from 10 to 11. He's only going to practice walking from 10 to 11 Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It's developmental. We wouldn't do that. Social emotional learning is the same way. It's developmental. They learn as they go. They learn by falling. They learn by struggling, right? And so we've got all these opportunities, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't teach social emotional learning in schools. Yes, we should. But there's so much more that should be happening at home. And it's just taking these moments. If we want them to be emotionally regulated, guess what they've got to see? Us being emotionally regulated. Because they are always watching us, and they learn best through modeling. How do I treat my sister? I'm learning by watching how mom and dad treat one another. How do I handle it when I get angry? How's mom and dad doing? I'm not saying that they copy it specifically, but I guess what I am saying is that if we want them to learn how to be emotionally regulated, we teach them how to do that. We show them. And that's our best way of learning. That's how we've learned forever. I like what James Baldwin says. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them. So they're watching. The second, and I think this is getting increasingly tricky for parents, is this idea of pause and ponder. So after the shooting in Highland Park, I was lucky enough to work with a social worker who's been doing trauma work for years. Her name is Mary Jo Barrett, and she's brilliant, and she's internationally known, and I got to come along for the ride with her. And I learned so much from her as she worked with folks. And one of the things that she said is that the key to healing, the key to managing stress, is being able to have a rhythm of what she called contracting and expanding. This idea that what happens when our stress response, remember I talked about our stress response always being up, that's what creates the biggest problems for us when we're experiencing stress. The idea is, can we bring it down? And so when she talks about contracting, it means quieting things down. It means slowing things down. And that's really our work, is to figure out, how can we create this rhythm? We've got these biorhythms, right? We're awake and we're active during the day, and then we sleep at night. There's a rhythm to that. And what we know is that the more we're in rhythm with that, sleep people will tell you, go to sleep and wake up at the same time, because that rhythm is so important. Sports teams have, they meet before the game, and then they play the first half, and they play really hard, and then they rest, and they reflect on the half together, and then they go out and play the second half, and then they stop and reflect on it. There's this rhythm to it that allows them to go, and this rhythm is really important. But what happens is the contraction is such an important part of the rhythm. We wouldn't say, oh yeah, if you want to have a really productive day, a really productive week, don't sleep, sleep on the weekend. We wouldn't say that. What we'd say is you've got an important meeting or you've got something big coming up, get a good night's sleep, contract before you expand, right? And that's the key, is we need to contract in order to expand. And this is where I think we've been getting it wrong. What she talks about is pausing and pondering, taking these moments. But children's lives have been expanding and we haven't been contracting them, right? We've got kids so active. And guess who else? When our kids are active, guess who else is really active? You guys. You've got to, not only do they have to get to their tree travel, to their 3 sports and their practices, and you've got to figure out, how am I going to get there? Who's going to bring the snacks? Who's going to get, do they need their shin pads or their helmet, right? There's all of this. Everybody is packed with more and more things, which means we are not taking the time we need to contract. The same thing is happening in our classrooms. We're saying we've got to get all through all these learning standards, and then we don't have breaks in between, and we don't take the time to rest. There's a great story, Blair Braverman. She's a dog musher. I bet you didn't know you were going to hear a dog mushing story today, right? She's a dog musher in Alaska, and what she does is she says, when I harness up my dogs, they just want to run, and they will run for 40 miles, and then they'll just collapse. She said, but that'd be great if our races were 35 miles long, but our races are 500 miles, and we do the Iditarod over 1,000 miles. She said, what we do is we run for 4 hours, and then we rest, and we sleep, and we eat, and we get warm, and we take care of one another for 2 hours, and then we run for another 4 hours. She says, we can go forever that way. That rhythm allows them to make it, right? And so these breaks are essential. Take a look. These are adult brains. So you've got, these are brains with no breaks. The red means that, the red and yellow mean that you're more stressed. The blue and greens means you're less stressed. Take a look at what happens after just one meeting. And then you go to the next meeting. But if you put a break in there, take a look. It's a 10-minute break. What they did was they put mindfulness in there. This is Microsoft, data from Microsoft. It's amazing how our brains can stay alive if we take the time to add that pause in between. How about kids and learning? They gave kids the exact same test. Different times a day in Denmark. 2 million kids, so a lot of kids. Take a look. It goes straight down. Except there's a bump here and there's a bump here. Why is that? They took a break. Now that may not look like a big enough bump. It doesn't get them back to baseline, right? But it's the same as giving those kids 3 additional weeks of instruction. A 10-minute break. And that's what it takes. Their brains come alive when we give them a break. One of the things that they've noticed is kids are getting less and less sleep. Between 1980 and 2010, kids started getting are getting an hour less sleep. What a difference that makes, especially if we're thinking about ADHD, symptoms of ADHD, behavior problems, obesity, academics issues, social skills problems, all are significantly impacted by 1 hour less sleep. And all of our kids are getting 1 hour less sleep. Is there any wonder why our kids are struggling more with mental health? Right? There's a lot of different factors, and this is one that just seems glaring to me. All right, strategy number 3 is, can we establish psychological safety in our homes and in our schools? Feeling physically safe, of course, is essential. But there's a lot of research on psychological safety, and believe it or not, some of that research comes out of Google. Google does a lot of research on us, probably, right? But also on their own teams. And so Google took a look at all of their, at 180 teams over 3 years. And they knew which teams were more productive and which teams were less productive. And they observed them, so they saw what's happening, what's the difference between these teams. And what they found is the main factors, there are 2 things that great teams did. And the first is everybody had equal airtime. Everybody's voice matters. And when everybody's voice doesn't get into the room, and it didn't have to be every meeting, but over the course of the 3 years, everybody spoke about the same amount. And if they didn't, then you were missing some voices, and then we were not as good as a team. And the second is attunement. This idea that we know we are sensitive to other people's feelings, we are sensitive to their emotional world, we know their stories, right? If I know that mom or dad is having a really tough week at work, I understand and can put their irritability into that context, right? I know with my dad, it didn't take much. I knew to shut up when my dad bit his tongue. It's like, time to be quiet, right? Our ability to read one another and these micro expressions, the more we know one another, the more that helps. And that's, again, why I like to do this in all of my talks, especially with staff people, is what I do is I want to get their voice in the room, and I want them to be a little bit more attuned to one another. And so what Amy Edmondson, who did this research for Harvard, and she coined the term psychological safety, she says psychological safety is, it's safe to take a risk here. It's safe to tell mom and dad that I didn't do my homework last night. It's safe to say I got a D because I didn't study. And if I do take a risk, I won't be humiliated or embarrassed or shamed because of it. And it's on this team, I feel comfortable being myself. Again, these are the things that you described in the places where you thrive. Do our kids experience this in our homes? What this talks about is feeling seen and heard. And one of the places that I like to think about, so in our families, does everybody have a voice? Is everybody able to talk? Does everybody feel comfortable talking? Do they feel safe? Are we attuned to one another? Do we share our stories that are hard and also our stories that we feel good about? This is hard for me when I'm with my kids. I don't like to talk about hard stuff at work, at home. They sure see my irritability, right? But they don't necessarily know, oh, that's because, he had a falling out with a colleague, or he had a talk that really didn't go well, or whatever that was, right? It's hard for me to talk about that, but what I know is that if I want them to tell me about these hard things, again, they're watching. Am I sharing my story? Family dinners. When we put the time into coming together, and I think in our busy lives, we have fewer and fewer family dinners. That was one of the beautiful things about COVID, is we never had family dinners. And then for 4 months straight, we had family dinners. And it was great, and we still have them now. But families who do family dinner, their higher vocabulary in their kids, greater achievement, their reading level goes up, their empathy and social skills, because they're practicing more with us. They're seeing us, they're watching us. Lower rates of suicide, substance abuse, depression, aggression, and sex. Not bad. So can we create, and I don't think for some families that just doesn't work, but can we have time together, routine time together where we know we're going to be together as a family? And the nice thing about family dinners is that we can be together and we're generally talking about things. I like grace, and it's not from a religious perspective, but grace does a lot of interesting things, right? Grace typically involves some gratitude. That's a healthy thing. Grace often involves touch, which triggers our oxytocin, which again is a healthy thing for us. And it gives us, oftentimes there's some level of quiet reflection. It's a mindful activity. So having family dinners, I like doing grace because it gives us that moment, those things that are healthy for us. We know it. It's not about the broccoli, right? Our kids are watching. They're learning from us. We're modeling for them, and they're listening. And again, we all learn best through modeling. All right. It's important that we have high expectations for kids, especially when our kids are struggling. Can we still have high expectations of them? And that's I think you mentioned accountability, right? Accountability comes with, I hold people accountable when I believe they can do something. And so oftentimes when we say, oh, this is going to be too hard for them, we just aren't going to do it. It impacts their sense of themselves. I don't have as much to contribute because people don't expect much from me. So I want to share some rat research. Kind of interesting. I'll bet you excited about some rat research tonight, right? So this guy named Robert Rosenthal, he was a psychologist, and he had a lot of rats in his lab, and he wondered, how do our expectations, can our expectations of rats actually change how quickly they learn to go through a maze? And so what he did, he had tons of rats and tons of research assistants. So he went around and on his cages, on his rat cages, he just randomly said, this is a smart rat and this is a dumb rat. And so then he said to his research assistants, you've got 2 weeks to teach them how to go through a maze. Go for it. And guess what happened? The rats who were labeled as smart, they were no smarter. The rats who were labeled as smart learned to go through through the maze twice as fast as the rats who were labeled dumb. Now, any idea why that might be? I had no idea either. So this is what he believed, that our expectations change our behavior. And here's what he found. There's some other interesting research that actually shows how this impacts things like our physical health. But what happened was, when we believed in these rats, the research assistants who believed their rats were smart spent more time holding them, spent more time petting them. And when you pet the back of the rat's neck, it stimulates brain growth. Who knew, right? But they spent more time because they believed in those rats. So what about kids? So this is the 1970s. They would never do this now. But he did the same thing in our classrooms. He went through and he said to teachers, just randomly assigned kids to and said to teachers, they didn't know it was random. Here are the kids with a high IQ. These kids are going to take off from your instruction. Here are the kids with low IQ. They're going to struggle, right? That was it. And then he came back and followed up to see a year later to see if they made what the progress was. And the kids who were just labeled with high IQ, who had no higher IQ, made twice the progress of the kids who were described as having lower IQ. So why is that? And there were certain things that these teachers did that were subtle. We treat students differently when we believe in them. We treat our kids differently when we believe in them. We're friendlier, we sit closer to them, we make more eye contact, we give them more detailed feedback, we call on them more. I trusted my daughter, who everything seemed to come easy to, even though she was 2 years younger than Matthew. I would trust her with stuff that I didn't trust with Matthew. And Matthew saw that. I can remember one time, and I'm still embarrassed by this. Matthew said, who's always running late, of course, who couldn't in any way clean his own room for the first 18 years of his life, right? And he said, we're going on vacation. He says, Dad, can I pack the car? 14 or 15 years old. And I said, no, you can't pack the car. I don't trust you to pack the car. It's going to be late. You're not going to know where to put things, like all of these things. And what I realized was there would have been nothing better for me than to let him pack the car. And yes, we might have left a half hour later. And yes, we might have hit rush hour traffic. And yes, I wish I had all those back so that at 14 or 15, he knew that even if he screwed it up, I could come back and say, why don't we try doing it this way? And I could coach him and teach him. But he wanted responsibility. And I didn't give that to him because I was so afraid it was going to mess other things up. Peter Block. I like this guy. He's a management consultant, but he talks a lot about belonging. He says, what makes community building so complex is that it occurs in an infinite number of small steps, sometimes in quiet moments that we notice out of the corner of our eye. It calls for us to treat as important many things we thought were incidental. In that moment, I just thought, it's going to be way more efficient if I pack the car. And Matthew, I haven't even talked with Matthew about that, but that's just one example of the number of times that I wish that I had trusted him with responsibility and then held him accountable for that, right? Both things are true. And then you would have learned accountability in a different way. Two more. Can we invite instead of exclude? One of the things that happens when kids struggle is we are quick to exclude them as our go-to strategy. In school, when kids misbehave, you've got a year suspended. When kids at home misbehave, we give them timeouts. Now we'll talk about timeouts again, and I think timeouts work, but not because of the way we think they work. I think timeouts work because we all need time away from people when it's going nuts. But oftentimes we believe that and this is the way it was framed from the very beginning, is removing kids from situations. The punishment of removing kids from situations will help them learn. The powerful adverse experience of being excluded will help them learn. In schools, so right before NCLB, there was another big thing that happened in schools, and that was Columbine, that I think also changed how we create Bolton in our schools. And it understandably shook all of us up, and still continues. Our fear, understandably, of school shootings has been reinforced over and over and over again. And one of the ways that we've responded to that is to create zero tolerance policies. So I am a big believer in school safety, and I'm also a big believer in the research to understand what helps schools be safe. And so one of the things that they did right after Columbine was zero tolerance. If you even did anything that threatened the safety of our school community, we are going to exclude you. Makes sense, right? Let's take a look at the research. So there's a couple things. It impacted students. So let's take a look at the impact on students just to begin with. One suspension increases their likelihood of arrest significantly. And it decreases the likelihood that they're going to graduate significantly. We should just know that, right? So every time we suspend a kid, the likelihood that there's going to be an arrest later on in their juvenile life, and we're going to show there's going to be a decreased likelihood when they graduate. And we also should know, and the Department of Civil Rights lets us know this very clearly, is that it's not equal. We don't punish and exclude kids in equal rates. Once disciplined in schools, kids were more likely to face further discipline or justice involvement if they are male, Black, Hispanic, disabled, or poor. Even after controlling for the student's conduct and other factors. So if we take everything and make it equal, we punish kids unequally. And we should know that. This is what we talk about with the school to prison pipeline. So that's part of what happens, right? But there's also a very important case to be made. We've got to keep our schools safe. And believe me, I was a principal of a school. It was the thing that frightened me the most, was a violent event in my school. So let's take a look at what zero tolerance policies actually do for the school environment. What Jamil Zaki, who does a lot of research on this, he says zero tolerance policies are meant to create norms that promote order, but they create hostility instead. Take a look at the actual research on this. When there are zero tolerance communities, test scores and trust in staff actually go down. And apathy and anxiety go up. And I think that's because when you're afraid you're going to make one mistake, and then you're going to get kicked out. These are for the kids who don't experience the discipline. Everybody's more anxious. So, a reasonable question: how can other students learn if we don't suspend and disrupt the dangerous students? Right? This makes sense to me. Let's take a look at the research. When schools serving similar populations were compared, those schools with the relatively low suspension rates had higher, not lower test scores. You know, the interesting thing is that when we suspend kids for, let's say, 10 days, which is the maximum you can suspend kids, that's 1/18 of the school year. All of a sudden, you've taken a kid who's struggling in school with safety and is on people's radar screen for not being safe, and then you're making school harder for them, you're alienating them more. Is that going to make them less or more safe? And you're only protecting the school environment 1/18%, like 6% of the year for the maximum suspension they can get. And so this is why State Bill 100, this is the state legislature says has put limits on suspension. Office of Civil Rights, Restorative Practices, Trauma-Informed Care, the U.S. Department of Education. And take a look at this last one. The United States Secret Service believes we shouldn't be excluding kids who are dangerous. Now, how is the United States Secret Service involved in this? It's interesting. I didn't know this, but the United States Secret Service are the ones who were charged with investigating Columbine and all of the other school shootings. So they're the ones who compiled all the data on this and have been most involved in working with the Department of Education. And what they found has been that was surprising to me and surprising to the people at the Department of Education. This is what the head of the Department of Education said. He said, referring to the Secret Service, this is one of the premier law enforcement agencies in the country, and yet at the top of their list was connecting kids with educators. What they said is when you've got a kid who is showing signs, when we do our behavioral threat assessment, they're showing signs of being at risk. We need to figure out who's their favorite teacher, get them more time. What's their favorite thing to do? Let's get them involved more, not less. That's what makes them safer. These are kids who don't feel like they belong. The more we exclude them, the less they feel like they belong, the more likely they are. Isn't that interesting? Connection through human relationships is a central component of a culture of safety and respect. This is what the Secret Service is telling us. I love this story. Kate knows this story well. She was good friends with Dan Cates. Dan Cates was the superintendent of District 211. A lot of 5 high schools, 12,000 kids. West suburbs. And when he was an assistant superintendent, he was in charge. He took a look and he said, we've got to reduce suspensions. Kids are getting suspended at way too high rates here. And so he came up with an idea that I think is brilliant and very counterintuitive. He said, and his staff didn't like it at first. He said, if an alternative, we're going to give every student who gets suspended, who is up for suspension, an alternative to suspension. And that alternative is to join a club. What does that say? We want you here more, not less. And he said, if there's not a club you like or want, we'll create it. I'll pay it. Let's find a staff person and they will mentor you in this. But we want you here more. And take a look at his data. It took a while. But from 2011 to 2019, total suspension days went from 2,500 all the way down to 500. An 80% decline. And I don't think any of us have heard about how out of control District 211 students are and all of the threats that are happening, that it's up for grabs. No, they reduced it by 80%. Imagine how many fewer kids are facing law enforcement involvement, how many more kids are graduating. Because one simple policy that says, we've got to include, we got to help these kids belong. Because for these kids, it feels toxic. We had a kid, Josh, he came to us at North Shore Academy as a 15-year-old. He was had failed out of 2 drug treatment programs. He was getting in fights at Deerfield High School. He let me tell the story. And he came to us because we had a lot of substance abuse programming. We did drug testing, we did groups, we did outdoor education activities for them. We did all sorts of stuff. So his parents said, this is the place for Josh. So Josh, within 3 weeks, hops in a car with another North Shore Academy kid and 2 friends from his neighborhood. Go into Chicago, buy heroin. Before they leave the city, he's already overdosed. And his friends left him in a gas station parking lot. He was revived. His parents, once he was medically stable, put him in a car, took him up to Hazelden up in Minnesota. And on their way back, I got a call from his dad. And I'll never forget the call. He was a super reasonable guy. He says, I want to let you know Josh makes his own choices, and I don't blame you for the choices Josh makes. We also believed that Josh was going to get help here with his substance abuse, and clearly that hasn't happened. And I want to let you know, I feel like it was a mistake to have him come to your school. And I was saddened, and I realized I couldn't argue with him. And I thought, we've got so many kids at risk. There's more that we need to be able to do. We pulled our people together and we thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to support these kids in different ways? And 4 months later, I get another call from his dad. And his dad says, we just picked Josh up from treatment. He's coming home, and we want him to come back to North Shore Academy. And I said, we have not changed that much. We've tried, but we have not changed that much. And I said, can I ask you why? I didn't expect this call. And he said, Josh has been in a lot of different programs. And he's never felt as cared for and connected as he did at North Shore Academy. If he's going to fight this addiction, he needs to be in a place where he feels connected. He needs to be in a place like the place you described, where he can thrive. And that starts with belonging. His dad knew that. And so we doubled down on belonging for Josh. We took this guy who was all tatted up, right? He was a drug addict. He was aggressive. And we put him in charge of our, we had him be a kind of a teaching assistant mentor to our middle school class. And they flocked to him like the Pied Piper. He would come in and they would cheer. And he was so good at it. And he would, and then he stayed sober. He would meet with other kids who were struggling with substance abuse issues. And he was so good at listening to them and not being judgy with them. And he did this, and he stayed sober. And so here he's graduating a couple years later. And as he's graduating, he leans in and he says, I'm so glad I'm graduating. I never have to read another book. And so he went into electrical engineering, and he was doing he had an apprenticeship in Pilsen and was living in Chicago, and he had Fridays off. And every Friday he'd come back up and he'd be with his middle school classroom. He stayed connected. And after a couple of years of doing that, I found this note on my desk, and he said, Smith, and Dr. Bolton Smith was his therapist. He said, I was blessed to have 5 years sober May 1st. Here's my chip I promised you. NSA has had a strong influence on my sobriety. You guys showed me what it's like to be kind and help others. I'm forever grateful. Show this chip to any student struggling, because it's possible to live a good life and get out of that misery and addiction. If I can do it, anyone can. Thank you for your help. I hope to continue one day at a time. It's amazing, right? So Josh ended up, and we'll talk about this next time, but he found that he did want to go back to school. And he decided he was going to go to Northeastern Illinois and become a social worker. And he said, I love reading now. Part of it was his brain's development. It's like, this means so much. And so here he is on his internship. He had to do an internship. And so here he is, like a few more tattoos, right? There he is with his therapist, Ms. Smith. And this is his internship interview. He got the job, believe it or not. And then Ms. Smith retired, and he was by far the best candidate. And he became a therapist at North Shore Academy. And it all started with belonging and feeling connected. And then finally, can we restore instead of punish? And I'm only going to talk about this a little bit, but I think it's really important. This idea of restorative practices is so common in our language, and so I think not well understood. But here's the thing. Oftentimes when kids screw up, we make them accountable to a punishment. And what we talked about was you're accountable to a relationship when you screw up. And that's very different. And that's what restorative practices are. Restorative practices are the practice of restoring relationships with people and a community after you've caused harm. It's not about going to your room for 15 minutes, for 20 minutes or the rest of the night after getting in an argument with your sister. It's yes, you may need to go and calm down, but then pieces, you got to make it right with her. Right? That's the work, is making it right. And so often when we deliver punishments, it's not about making it right, it's about serving my time. And in order to implement restorative practices, we need relationships to restore. That's the part. We don't feel like we have to restore when something happens in a toxic community. In a belonging community, we are accountable. And that's the difference. How do we welcome them back? Is really the question. It's not, do we have to exclude them? Yes, sometimes we need to separate people. The question is, do we welcome them back? And everybody has a story. At schools, what we need to know is, what is the story that they're experiencing? And oftentimes we don't listen. We just say, oh, they're just selfish. They didn't want, they're just too impulsive, whatever it is. But there's a story. Every time a kid screws up, there's a story behind it. The question is, can we just stop and ask, what was happening for you in that moment? I'm curious, and to hear their story. And then you can help them understand that, and then help them be accountable. But we need to be curious first. And what people will say, so many people who've lived very hard lives, you ask them, why didn't you tell anybody? They'll say, nobody ever has. Can we be curious when someone does something that's infuriating? We just ask, and they may not know the answer. So often we don't know the answer, why we get angry about something that a day later doesn't seem like a big deal. The idea is, can we begin to get them thinking and wondering, what was it that happened? The problem for kids who struggle the most is that they need communities of belonging. And they get the fewest doses of belonging. They need those micro expressions. They need to know when they walk into their classroom, their teacher is so thrilled that they walked in the room. When Matthew comes home for dinner after avoiding school, to know that Dad's excited to see him, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do about that, about missing school. Both things can be true. It's really hard, and it's essential. So here's what I want you to do. I'd love for you, I'm going to tell one more story at the end. But I want for you just to think of one thing that you're going to take away from tonight. What's one idea, one thought, just so there's so much that we've talked about, just so that you can then say, okay, what's the one thing I'm going to take from today and really be thoughtful about, and see how this can change who I am as a parent, or inform who I am as a parent. And then just share that, just one thing, just take 30 seconds and share it with the person next to you, just to get your voices in the room, get you to reflect a minute, pause for a minute before we finish up. All right. So I want to just end with a quote. I don't have the slide up here, but I want to end with this quote, and that is by Peter Block again. I mentioned him earlier. He said, "How do you change the world one room at a time? Which room? The one you're in." And I guess every time our kids are struggling in these moments, can we first create communities of belonging in school and at home? And then the other piece is, in these hardest moments, can we make sure that they experience belonging and that we still have to work on what issue it was that came up? That both are important. And yet we often discard belonging in our effort to get them to behave. And we'll talk a little bit more next time about better understanding why they struggle when they struggle. And notice when we struggle as parents, why we struggle when we struggle as well. All right, so thank you all. This was longer than I thought. I'm sorry to keep you so long. I wanted to make sure the snow and rain stopped before you left, so I just kept talking. I hope that's the case now. And I'll take whatever questions you've got, and if you've got to go, feel free to get up and go now. I overstayed my welcome, so but yeah, you've got a question. It's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing I love about that, and I'm not sure if you guys want to respond now, but I love that idea of how do we include the whole community, right? And the kids being a really important part of our community. And also I think that, I guess I also think this is pretty simple, right? Conceptually, it's not hard to figure out. And intuitively, we also can feel this. The question is, how can we create dialogues around this, whether that be through a large group, through how do we create this within our classroom? So I think I appreciate the question, and I can't answer how the district will do it, but I appreciate the question.
I love that. It's fine for parents to community and on it's fine so hard.
Yeah.
I feel like having fun and favorite places to be connected, but we have a lot of these issues are more impactful.
Yeah.
Great belonging to burn in the third grade, sixth grade, but the concern of that smart enough and see it and aware enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get those identify it, mean it, make them think about it.
And have common language, right? So that we're all working with the same language. Other questions or reflections, and I'm not sure if there are questions coming up, Marty, on the.
Nope, not yet.
All right, well, I'll be up here if anyone wants to ask a question more privately, but thank you all for coming. And I so enjoy this time with all of you, so thank you.
Thank you.
You'll